70,000 years ago, beneath a sky rendered apocalyptic by volcanic ash, a small band of humans huddled together on the southern coast of Africa. Their numbers had dwindled catastrophically. Perhaps only a few thousand remained alive on the entire planet. They were hungry, they were frightened, and they were the last of their kind. The world around them had become unrecognizable. Temperatures plummeted as sunlight struggled to penetrate the atmospheric veil left by the Toba supervolcano. Plants withered, animals vanished, and human communities across the globe faced extinction. Yet this small group survived, and from their genetic lineage, all modern humans would eventually descend. Welcome to one of humanity's most profound mysteries, the genetic bottleneck that nearly erased our species from existence, a catastrophe so complete that our DNA still bears its scars today. A moment when, by some estimates, as few as 1,280 breeding humans remained alive. That number deserves contemplation. Imagine a small high school gymnasium filled with frightened survivors. That's all that remained of humanity. Every person alive today can trace their lineage back to those individuals. All 8 billion of us. The evidence lies written in our genetic code, a moment when human diversity collapsed, when countless lineages vanished forever, and when the trajectory of our species hung by the thinnest of threads. Yet the story remains contested, debated, and shrouded in scientific uncertainty. Some researchers point to the Toba supervolcano eruption in Indonesia approximately 75,000 years ago. Others suggest prolonged climate shifts or competition with other human species. The cause remains elusive, but the genetic evidence persists. Imagine yourself among that small band of survivors, the world grown cold and unforgiving, resources dwindling, other human communities falling silent one by one, until only your group remained, unaware that the future of humanity rested entirely in your hands. What would you hold on to? What knowledge would you preserve? What memories would you pass to your children, who would become the ancestors of every human being alive today? This documentary explores not just how humanity nearly vanished, but how we survived at all, how knowledge and adaptations were preserved through this evolutionary checkpoint, and what we might have lost along the way. The traces of this bottleneck appear not only in our genetics, but potentially in our myths. Stories of great floods, world-ending catastrophes, and small bands of chosen survivors exist across cultures separated by vast distances and time. Are these cultural memories of our shared near extinction? Using the latest findings in population genetics, archaeology, climatology, and comparative mythology, we'll examine this profound moment in human history. A moment that shaped everything we would become. Archaeological evidence suggests that our species, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, we were simply one human species among many: Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and others. But something happened, something that left only us, something that nearly destroyed us in the process, yet something that may have catalyzed our capacity for innovation, cooperation, and cultural transmission. The genetic data tells us that approximately 70,000 years ago, human genetic diversity collapsed dramatically. Mitochondrial DNA evidence suggests we descend from a small population, perhaps just a few thousand individuals. Some calculations point to as few as 280 breeding adults. For perspective, that's fewer people than typically attend a small-town high school football game. A population so small that a single disease, climate event, or resource shortage could have ended our species completely. The human story nearly concluded before it truly began. Yet we survived. And not only survived, but eventually thrived, spreading across the planet, developing agriculture, building civilizations, and ultimately reaching the stars. But we carry the legacy of that bottleneck in every cell of our bodies. In our genetic code lies evidence of what we lost. Variations and adaptations that disappeared forever. Alternative paths of human development that were suddenly cut short. The bottleneck acted as a ruthless filter, preserving some traits while eliminating others. Over the next 2 hours, we'll travel from the shores of South Africa to the heights of Indonesian volcanoes, from genetic laboratories to ancient mythological texts, all to understand the moment humanity nearly vanished, and how that moment made us who we are today. Because the most profound question isn't simply how we survived, but whether that survival was mere chance, or if something unique about those particular 1,280 humans allowed them to endure when all others perished. This is our story, your story, the inheritance of memory that connects us all to that small band of survivors who carried the future of humanity through its darkest hour. Chapter 2. The sixth extinction that wasn't the stakes could not be higher. If the genetic bottleneck hypothesis is correct, humanity balanced on the knife edge of extinction roughly 70,000 years ago. A moment when our entire species was reduced to perhaps just 1,280 breeding adults. To comprehend the significance of this number, consider that a single modern sports arena can hold 50 times that many people. The entire future of human existence, all our art, science, literature, music, and innovation, depended on a population smaller than a typical high school. Had the population decreased even slightly more, we might have crossed the threshold where genetic diversity becomes too limited for a species to recover. Inbreeding depression, vulnerability to disease, and reduced adaptability would have sentenced us to a slow extinction, or perhaps a sudden environmental shift, a disease outbreak, or competition from other human species might have delivered the final blow. Homo sapiens could have joined the growing list of extinct human lineages, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, evolutionary branches that withered, but we didn't disappear. Something about those specific survivors allowed them to endure, and their genetic legacy now extends to every human on Earth. From the Amazon rainforest to the Arctic Circle, we all carry the signature of that bottleneck. The implications reshape our understanding of human nature. If we all descend from such a small founding population, then the differences between human populations and so-called races become vanishingly insignificant. We are in genetic terms remarkably similar to one another. Our genetic uniformity stands in stark contrast to other great apes. A single troop of chimpanzees in Africa contains more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans alive today. This unexpected homogeneity has long puzzled geneticists. The bottleneck hypothesis offers an elegant explanation. Our genetic similarity isn't the product of our recent evolution, rather of our near extinction. The crucible that nearly destroyed us also forged our remarkable unity. But the implications extend beyond genetics into culture and psychology. If humanity was reduced to such small numbers, then the survival behaviors, technologies, and social structures of those specific survivors would have disproportionately shaped all future human societies. Consider the possibilities. What if those survivors possessed particular cognitive traits, social structures, or technological adaptations that proved crucial to their survival? Would humanity be fundamentally different if another group had survived instead? Their specific cultural innovations, tools, language patterns, social organization, artistic expressions, became the foundation from which all subsequent human cultures would develop. A kind of evolutionary and cultural reset point. The bottleneck may explain curious patterns in human psychology, our species-wide fear of snakes and spiders, even in regions where these pose little threat, our universal capacity for language acquisition, our remarkably similar emotional responses across cultures. Perhaps most intriguing is how the bottleneck might connect to our mythology. Stories of extinction and small bands of survivors appear in cultures worldwide. From Noah's Ark to the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh epic, from indigenous Australian Dreamtime to Mesoamerican creation myths, could these narratives be cultural memories of our shared catastrophe? Warnings passed down through countless generations, reminding us of how close we came to oblivion. The persistence of flood myths across disconnected cultures becomes particularly significant in this light. These stories typically include a divine warning, a chosen few survivors, and the repopulation of the world from this small group. The parallels to our genetic bottleneck are difficult to ignore, though proving direct transmission of such ancient memories remains challenging. But the bottleneck theory faces scholarly challenges. Some geneticists argue for a more gradual population reduction rather than a sudden catastrophic event. Others suggest multiple bottlenecks rather than a single defining moment. The debate continues. The timing also remains contested. While many researchers point to approximately 70,000 years ago, coinciding with the Toba supervolcano eruption, others suggest different timeframes or multiple events that progressively reduced human populations over thousands of years. Yet the genetic evidence for some form of population collapse remains compelling. Mitochondrial DNA studies, which trace maternal lineages, suggest all humans descend from a small population of mitochondrial Eve and her contemporaries. Y chromosome studies tell a similar story. What's at stake in this investigation isn't merely academic. If we came so close to extinction once, we could face similar threats again. Understanding what factors nearly destroyed us and what allowed that small band to survive may prove crucial to our future. Climate change, pandemic disease, resource depletion. Many of the challenges we face today echo the existential threats of our deep past. The lessons of the bottleneck may help us navigate our increasingly precarious present. Additionally, if the bottleneck hypothesis is correct, it fundamentally changes how we understand human nature and potential. Our remarkable adaptability, our capacity for innovation under pressure, our ability to cooperate in crisis. These may be direct inheritances from those survivors. They weren't just any humans who managed to survive by chance. They may have possessed specific traits, behaviors, and cultural adaptations that allowed them to endure when others perished. Their legacy shapes us still. The story of humanity's near extinction and unlikely survival may be the most important story we've forgotten. Until now. Chapter 3. Before the bottleneck. To understand what happened during humanity's near extinction, we must first understand what came before. The world of 100,000 years ago was profoundly different from our own, not just environmentally, but in terms of human diversity itself. Homo sapiens had already existed for roughly 200,000 years, emerging in Africa as one of several human species that walked the earth. We shared the planet with Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia, and potentially other human species not yet discovered. Our ancestors weren't alone in possessing complex cultures. Neanderthals created art, buried their dead with ritual, crafted sophisticated tools, and even appears to have used medicinal plants. Denisovans developed technologies advanced enough to create delicate stone bracelets and needles. These were not the brutish, primitive creatures of popular imagination. They were sophisticated humans with their own innovations and adaptations. They had successfully inhabited their territories for hundreds of thousands of years. Genetic evidence shows that early Homo sapiens interbred with both Neanderthals and Denisovans. Most non-African populations today carry approximately 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some Asian and oceanic populations carry additional Denisovan heritage. This interbreeding suggests that these different human species recognized each other as potential mates, not merely as competitors or prey. The boundaries between human species were evidently more fluid than we once believed. Early Homo sapiens populations were diverse and widespread throughout Africa. Archaeological evidence indicates distinct cultural traditions developing in different regions. From the elaborate ochre processing workshop at Blombos Cave in South Africa to the sophisticated tools of North Africa. These early humans were accomplished artists. The earliest known abstract art dates to 73,000 years ago, a cross-hatched pattern drawn with ochre crayon on stone from Blombos Cave. Beads, pendants, and other personal ornaments from this period suggest symbolic thinking. They were technological innovators as well. Heat-treated stone tools, bone implements, and complex composite tools appear in the archaeological record. Evidence suggests they used adhesives, requiring sophisticated planning and material knowledge. Their cognitive capabilities were essentially modern. They possessed language, symbolic thought, technological innovation, artistic expression, and complex social organization. The hardware of human genius was fully in place, Populations of early humans were relatively small and scattered compared to today's standards. Estimates suggest perhaps a few 100,000 Homo sapiens existed worldwide before the bottleneck, living in bands typically numbering between 20 and 150 individuals. These groups were highly mobile, following seasonal resources and adapting to local conditions. Their technologies and social structures were tailored to specific environments, from coastal adaptations focusing on shellfish harvesting to inland strategies centered on hunting large game. Genetic evidence suggests considerable diversity among these early human populations, greater than what we see in modern humans today. Different lineages had been developing separately for thousands of years across the African continent. The world they inhabited was in the grip of the last ice age. 75,000 years ago, Earth's climate was relatively stable, though cooler than today. Vast ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels were significantly lower. This exposed land bridges that don't exist today, connecting Asia to North America across the Bering Strait, Europe, and creating a much narrower gap between Southeast Asia and Australia. The environment was rich with megafauna now extinct. Mammoths, giant sloths, cave bears, and enormous birds roamed landscapes that would seem alien to modern eyes. These animals had evolved alongside hominids and were wary of human hunters. Early humans had developed specialized hunting techniques for these formidable prey. Cooperative strategies, specialized weapons, and detailed knowledge of animal behavior allowed them to take down creatures many times their size and strength. Plant knowledge was equally sophisticated. Archaeological evidence suggests detailed understanding of which plants were edible, medicinal, or useful for technological purposes. This knowledge was passed down through generations of careful observation and cultural transmission. Then something changed, dramatically and catastrophically. Approximately 75,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Sumatra, Indonesia, erupted in one of the most powerful volcanic events of the past 2 million years. An eruption thousands of times more powerful than Mount St. Helens, ejecting an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. To put this in perspective, the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption ejected about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba's eruption was on an almost unimaginable scale, the largest volcanic event in the past 25 million years. Ash from the eruption covered much of South Asia in deposits up to 15 feet thick. Volcanic material circled the globe, blocking sunlight and triggering what scientists call a volcanic winter. Global temperatures may have dropped by as much as 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for several years. This cooling would have been catastrophic for plant and animal life adapted to previous conditions. Growing seasons shortened dramatically. Plant productivity declined, and the animals that depended on those plants began to starve, including humans. Evidence for this climate catastrophe appears in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, which show a significant sulfate spike corresponding to the Toba eruption. Lake sediments across Asia show ash deposits. The timing is crucial. The Toba eruption coincides remarkably well with the genetic bottleneck identified in human DNA. This correlation has led many researchers to propose a causal relationship between the two events. However, the Toba catastrophe theory remains controversial. Some archaeological sites in India show human occupation seemingly continuing uninterrupted through the Toba ash layers, suggesting that at least some populations survived the immediate aftermath. Alternative theories propose that the bottleneck resulted not from a single catastrophic event, but from prolonged climate instability, or from competition with other human species, or from novel diseases that swept through vulnerable populations. What remains clear is that something dramatic happened to human populations around this time, something that reduced our numbers so severely that we nearly vanished from Earth altogether. And in the aftermath of this near extinction, something equally remarkable occurred. The survivors began to innovate at unprecedented rates. New tool technologies, expanded art forms, and complex social organizations emerged with surprising rapidity. This period, beginning roughly 65,000 years ago, saw humans rapidly expanding beyond Africa. Reaching Australia by 65,000 years ago, Europe by 45,000 years ago, and eventually crossing into the Americas. It was as if the bottleneck, whatever its cause, had acted as an evolutionary catalyst, selecting for traits that would define humanity's future success: adaptability, innovation, cooperation, and cultural transmission. The question remains: who were those survivors? What allowed them to endure when others perished? And how did their specific traits shape the future of our species? The answers lie in the evidence they left behind. Chapter 4: The Genetic Echo. The first concrete evidence of humanity's near extinction doesn't come from volcanic ash or archaeological remains. It comes from within our own bodies. Written in the language of DNA, a molecular signature that points to a moment when our species almost disappeared. When geneticists analyze human DNA from populations around the world, they find something unexpected. Despite our obvious physical diversity, we are remarkably similar at the genetic level. More similar than most other species, including our closest relatives, chimpanzees. A single troop of chimpanzees in Africa contains more genetic diversity than humans alive today. This is deeply counterintuitive. How could a species spread across every continent, adapting to environments from Arctic tundra to Saharan desert, be so genetically uniform? The answer lies in what geneticists call a population bottleneck, a sharp reduction in numbers that eliminates much genetic diversity. Like drawing just a few colored marbles from a jar containing hundreds of varieties, the selected few determine all future possibilities. Mitochondrial DNA provides some of the strongest evidence for this bottleneck. These specialized genetic sequences, passed directly from mother to child without recombination, allow scientists to trace maternal lineages back through time with remarkable precision. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA suggests all living humans descend from a single woman who lived in Africa approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Popularly known as mitochondrial Eve, she wasn't the only woman alive at that time, but the only one whose maternal lineage survives. Similar analysis of Y chromosome DNA, which passes from father to son, points to a Y chromosomal Adam who lived roughly 60,000 to 90,000 years ago. Again, not the only man alive, but the only one whose direct paternal lineage continues unbroken to the present. The relatively recent date of this Y chromosomal ancestor, compared to the mitochondrial ancestor, suggests a period when many male lineages disappeared. Consistent with a population crash where few males successfully reproduced, a genetic signature of catastrophe. Looking beyond these sex-specific markers to the broader human genome, scientists find additional evidence for a severe population reduction. Patterns of linkage disequilibrium, how genes are inherited together, suggest our ancestors once numbered only a few thousand individuals. Some mathematical models based on genetic diversity suggest the bottleneck reduced humanity to as few as 1,280 breeding individuals. Though estimates vary, with some researchers suggesting figures between 3,000 and 10,000 people, still a precariously small population. For comparison, the International Union for Conservation of Nature classifies any species with fewer than 2,500 mature individuals as endangered, and those with under 250 as critically endangered. By these modern conservation standards, humanity would have qualified as endangered. This genetic bottleneck appears to date to approximately 70,000 years ago, coinciding with the Toba supervolcano eruption. Though whether Toba caused the bottleneck remains debated, the timing is certainly suggestive. Beyond population size, genetic evidence reveals something equally significant about these survivors. They appear to have lived primarily in East Africa, particularly in territories corresponding to modern Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. The greatest human genetic diversity today exists in these regions, consistent with the theory that these populations have had the longest time to accumulate genetic variations since the bottleneck. They represent the source from which all non-African populations would later derive. Fascinatingly, archaeological evidence from this region and time period shows innovations appearing in the material record. New stone tool technologies, more sophisticated hunting weapons, the first evidence of fishing as a significant food source. Expanded use of ochre for symbolic purposes. Sites like Enkapune ya Muto in Kenya, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, contain some of the earliest known ostrich eggshell beads. Complex symbolic artifacts suggesting advanced cultural transmission and possibly trade networks. The genetic evidence also reveals something profound about what happened after the bottleneck. Beginning around 60,000 years ago, human populations began to expand rapidly, first within Africa, then spreading to Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. This expansion created a series of smaller secondary bottlenecks, as small groups of pioneers separated from the main population. Each migration further reduced genetic diversity in the new populations. A pattern geneticists call the serial founder effect. This explains why genetic diversity decreases with distance from East Africa. East African populations contain approximately 14% more genetic diversity than indigenous Australian populations, who in turn have more diversity than Native American populations. The genetic legacy of the bottleneck extends to functional genes as well. Our species shows unusually low diversity in immune system genes compared to other primates, potentially explaining our vulnerability to certain pathogens. Some researchers suggest the bottleneck affected cognitive evolution, potentially selecting for enhanced social cognition, language capabilities, and cooperative tendencies, traits that would prove crucial for a small population's survival under extreme pressure. The evidence has recently been supplemented by climatic data. Ice cores, ocean sediments, and cave formations all record a period of extreme climate instability beginning around 75,000 years ago, coinciding with the Toba eruption and the genetic bottleneck. Analysis of these climate proxies suggests global cooling of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius lasting several years, followed by centuries of unstable climate, creating precisely the conditions that would stress human populations to the breaking point. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from combining genetic data with archaeological findings. In southern Africa, sites that were occupied continuously for tens of thousands of years show sudden abandonment coinciding with the bottleneck period. When human occupation resumes in these locations, the material culture often shows significant changes, new tool types, different resource exploitation patterns, changes in symbolic expression, as if the returning populations brought different cultural adaptations. The emerging picture is one of fragmented populations, drastically reduced in size, struggling to survive in isolated refugia, perhaps in specially favored locations where microclimate or resource abundance offered protection from the wider catastrophe. Then something remarkable happened. The survivors began to innovate at unprecedented rates. New technologies appeared. Social structures became more complex. Symbolic communication expanded, and humans began to spread across the planet with extraordinary speed. It's as if the bottleneck, despite nearly destroying our species, somehow catalyzed the very adaptations that would ultimately make us the planet's dominant life form. A crucible that nearly broke us, but instead transformed us. But the question remains, why did those specific 1,280 individuals survive when countless others perished? Was it merely luck, being in the right place when disaster struck? Or did they possess specific adaptations, behaviors, or technologies that proved crucial? And if certain traits allowed them to survive, how have those traits shaped every human who has lived since? Are we all inheritors, not just of their genes, but of their specific cognitive tendencies, social structures, and adaptive strategies? The answer may lie in the places they sought refuge, the specific environments that sheltered them through humanity's darkest hour, and in the extraordinary innovations that appeared immediately afterward. Innovations that would change the course of human history forever. As we follow their footsteps across ancient landscapes, we begin to unravel the mystery of who these survivors were, and why, against all odds, they managed to preserve the human story when it teetered on the edge of extinction. What they carried with them, what knowledge, what technologies, what social adaptations, would become the foundation for all future human societies. a legacy that continues, unbroken, to shape our world today. But the evidence takes an unexpected turn when we examine the specific location where these survivors appear to have weathered the catastrophe, a place that offers crucial clues about how they managed to endure and what made them different from those who perished. Chapter 5. The Coastal Refuge Theory. As compelling as the genetic evidence for a human bottleneck appears, a growing body of archaeological findings presents puzzling contradictions. Not all sites show evidence of abandonment during the bottleneck period, and human occupation seems to have continued uninterrupted in some regions. Excavations at Jwalapuram in India reveal stone tools both below and above the Toba ash layer, suggesting humans in this region survived the supervolcano's immediate aftermath, challenging the idea of a single catastrophic event that nearly eliminated our species globally. Similarly, archaeological sites in South Africa show continuous occupation through the bottleneck period, particularly along coastal regions where shellfish and marine resources provided reliable food sources even when inland environments became less productive. This has led to the development of what researchers call the coastal refuge theory, the idea that human populations contracted primarily to coastal regions during the bottleneck period, where marine resources offered a buffer against climate-induced food scarcity. The archaeological signature of these coastal refuges appears most clearly in sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, where evidence shows humans systematically harvesting shellfish and marine mammals beginning around 164,000 years ago, well before the bottleneck. Time environmental conditions deteriorated, these coastal populations had already developed specialized knowledge of marine ecosystems, exploit resources that remained relatively stable even as inland food sources declined. Intriguingly, these coastal sites show evidence of symbolic behavior and technological innovation precisely during the bottleneck period. The first definitive evidence of ochre processing for symbolic purposes appears at Blombos Cave approximately 73,000 years ago. The timing suggests something remarkable, that the extreme pressure of near extinction may have catalyzed cognitive and cultural innovations, as if the survivors responded to existential threat by developing new capacities for symbolic thought, social cohesion, and technological adaptation. But this raises a profound question. Were these innovations the result of the bottleneck, or the reason certain populations survived it? Did the pressure of near extinction drive innovation, or did pre-existing innovative capacity allow these specific groups to survive? The genetic evidence suggests something unexpected. Analysis of ancient DNA from pre-bottleneck human remains shows significant genetic divergence from modern humans, as if the bottleneck didn't just reduce our numbers, but specifically preserved certain lineages while eliminating others. This selectivity complicates the simple narrative of random survival. It suggests the bottleneck may have acted as an evolutionary filter, preserving populations with specific adaptive traits while eliminating others, a form of natural selection operating at the population level. Further complicating the picture is evidence that contradicts the Toba catastrophe theory. While the supervolcano's eruption coincides with the genetic bottleneck, climate records from some regions show less dramatic cooling than would be expected from a global volcanic winter. Lake core samples from East Africa, for instance, show relatively stable temperatures through the Toba eruption period. Environmental impact may have been regionally variable rather than uniformly catastrophic, creating a patchwork of refugia rather than a single survival zone. If the bottleneck wasn't caused solely by Toba, what other factors might have contributed? One hypothesis points to competition with other human species, particularly as Homo sapiens began expanding beyond Africa, around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago. The timing of Neanderthal decline in Europe correlates with the arrival of Homo sapiens, suggesting potential competition for resources or direct conflict. Similar patterns appear with other human species, including the Denisovans in Asia. Could interspecies competition have contributed to population crashes among multiple human lineages, creating ecological pressure that only certain populations could withstand. The evidence remains circumstantial, but provocative. Disease provides another potential explanation. Novel pathogens can devastate populations lacking immunity, as demonstrated by historical examples like the European diseases that decimated indigenous American populations following contact. Ancient DNA analysis has revealed that survivors of the bottleneck carried specific immune system adaptations, suggesting they may have possessed resistance to pathogens that devastated other populations. Another form of selective pressure that shaped human survival. The geographic distribution of bottleneck survivors presents additional puzzles. While genetic evidence points primarily to East Africa, archaeological sites in South Africa show some of the most compelling evidence for cultural innovation during this period. This apparent contradiction has led some researchers to propose a multiple refugia hypothesis, the idea that small populations survived in isolated locations, but that East African lineages ultimately became demographically dominant in the post-bottleneck expansion. Perhaps the most perplexing contradiction comes from comparing human population dynamics with those of other large mammals during the same period. Few show evidence of population crashes coinciding with the Toba eruption. Why would humans be uniquely vulnerable? One possibility is that our species had already expanded into marginal environments where our survival depended on cultural adaptations rather than biological ones, making us more vulnerable to environmental disruption than species with longer evolutionary histories in those regions. Another explanation suggests that human population densities were already low before the bottleneck, making local extinctions more likely when conditions deteriorated, a case of small populations becoming critically small rather than large populations being decimated. The archaeological record reveals another anomaly, the appearance of sophisticated projectile weapons coinciding with the bottleneck period, particularly the widespread adoption of bow and arrow technology in some regions, dramatically increasing hunting efficiency. Did this technological innovation provide a crucial survival advantage during resource scarcity, allowing some groups to harvest protein more efficiently than others? The timing suggests a potential connection between technological adaptation and survival. Equally significant is evidence for expanded social networks during this period. Marine shells from coastal regions appear at inland sites hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting trade networks or population movement between coastal and interior zones. These expanded social networks may have provided a crucial buffer against local resource failures, allowing information and materials to flow between groups experiencing different conditions, a form of risk management through social connection. The contradictions in our evidence point to a more complex narrative than a simple population crash and recovery. The bottleneck appears to have been selective rather than random, preserving specific adaptations, technologies, and social strategies. Even more intriguing is what happened immediately after the bottleneck. Beginning around 65,000 years ago, human populations began expanding with unprecedented speed, not just numerically, but geographically, reaching Australia by 65,000 years ago. This expansion required maritime technology sophisticated enough to cross open ocean. Evidence for planned sea voyages represents a quantum leap in technological capability. Did the bottleneck somehow accelerate human innovation, or did innovative capacity drive post-bottleneck success? Similarly puzzling is the timing of the great leap in symbolic expression. Cave painting, figurative art, and musical instruments appear in the archaeological record shortly after the bottleneck, as if something fundamental had changed in human cognitive capacity. But perhaps the most significant contradiction lies in comparing genetic diversity between populations. While overall human genetic diversity is low, certain gene clusters show unexpected variation, particularly genes related to brain development and immune function. These specific variations suggest the bottleneck may have been followed by intense selective pressure on cognitive and immune capabilities, potentially explaining the rapid cultural developments that followed, a form of accelerated human evolution. The coastal refuge theory offers a compelling framework for understanding these contradictions. Coastal environments provided both resource stability and environmental conditions that favored innovation, while promoting gene flow between otherwise isolated populations. Evidence from coastal archaeological sites shows precisely the pattern we would expect: continuous occupation through the bottleneck period, increasing technological sophistication, expanded symbolic behavior, and the first evidence of long-distance trade networks. But the coastal refuge theory raises its own puzzling questions. If coastal environments provided such advantages, why didn't human populations remain exclusively coastal? What drove the rapid post-bottleneck expansion into continental interiors and harsh environments? And why did some coastal populations apparently fail to survive, despite their environmental advantages? Archaeological evidence suggests human presence along coastlines globally before the bottleneck. Yet the genetic evidence points to survival primarily in East Africa. These contradictions suggest the bottleneck story remains incomplete. The evidence points not simply to environmental catastrophe and random survival, but to a complex interplay of environmental pressure, technological innovation, social adaptation, and possibly cognitive evolution. What if the bottleneck wasn't merely a population crash, but an evolutionary inflection point? A moment when specific human adaptations, perhaps cognitive, technological, or social, proved decisively advantageous, shaping everything we would become. The evidence increasingly suggests we are not merely the descendants of lucky survivors, but the inheritors of specific adaptations that allowed those 1,080 individuals to endure when others perished. Adaptations that continue to define human capability today. To understand what those adaptations might have been, we must look beyond archaeology and genetics, to the oldest human stories, tales of catastrophe, survival, and transformation that may preserve cultural memories of our closest brush with extinction. Chapter 6. Echoes in Myth. Across the world, separated by vast distances and thousands of years, human cultures tell remarkably similar stories. Tales of great floods that nearly destroyed humanity, of divine warnings given to chosen individuals, of small bands of survivors who repopulated the world. From the biblical account of Noah to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, from indigenous Australian songlines to Mesoamerican creation myths, these narratives share striking similarities: a world-destroying catastrophe, divine intervention, and a new beginning with few survivors. Could these stories preserve cultural memories of the bottleneck event? Oral histories transmitted across hundreds of generations, gradually transformed into religious narratives. The possibility has intrigued both anthropologists and geneticists. The Mesopotamian flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, dated to approximately 2100 BCE, tells of Utnapishtim, who builds a boat to survive a flood sent by the gods. The parallels to Noah's Ark are obvious, but the Mesopotamian version predates the biblical account by centuries. Indigenous Australian Dreamtime stories speak of a time when the creator being Ngaliod, often depicted as a rainbow serpent, caused great floods that transformed the landscape. These narratives come from cultures with oral histories potentially stretching back 65,000 years. Greek mythology describes the Deucalion flood, in which Zeus decided to end the Bronze Age with a great deluge. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha survived by building a chest. After floating for 9 days, they landed on Mount Parnassus. Hindu traditions tell of Manu, who was warned of a great flood by a fish. He built a ship and survived the deluge. When the waters receded, his vessel came to rest on the mountains, and he became the progenitor of a new human race. Chinese flood myths center on Gun and his son Yu, who worked to control a great flood sent by the gods. Yu eventually succeeded through great engineering works, becoming the founder of the Xia dynasty. Across the Pacific, Polynesian cultures tell variations of a story in which the god Ruahatu informs Taaroa of his plan to destroy the world with a flood. Taaroa and his wife climb a mountain or build a boat to survive, repopulating the islands afterward. In the Americas, numerous indigenous cultures preserve flood narratives. The Lenape tell of a great deluge survived only by those who had been forewarned and built rafts. Maya creation myths describe multiple destructions and recreations of humanity. The global distribution of these narratives is difficult to explain through cultural diffusion alone. Many emerged in populations separated by vast distances with no known contact until recent centuries, suggesting either independent origins or extremely ancient shared roots. What makes these stories particularly intriguing in the context of the bottleneck hypothesis is their consistent emphasis on small numbers of survivors, usually a single family or small group. Mirroring the genetic evidence for a dramatic population reduction, these narratives typically include specific elements that align with bottleneck scenarios: a warning received by chosen individuals, preparation through gathering resources or building shelter, survival of a small group, and the repopulation of the world from this founding group. If these myths preserve cultural memories of the bottleneck, they suggest something crucial about the survivors: that their escape from extinction wasn't merely lucky, but involved foreknowledge, preparation, and specific survival strategies. A narrative of agency rather than chance. Beyond flood myths, other widespread narrative patterns might connect to bottleneck experiences: stories of journeys to new lands, narratives of culture heroes who bring transformative knowledge, and myths of human origins from a specific sacred location. These cultural universals might preserve aspects of post-bottleneck expansion and adaptation, the journeys of small groups into new territories, the transmission of crucial survival knowledge, and the memory of ancestral homelands from which all people ultimately descended. But mythology provides only circumstantial evidence. The temporal gap between the bottleneck, approximately 70,000 years ago, and the earliest written myths, less than 5,000 years ago, creates an enormous transmission challenge. Could oral traditions possibly preserve memories across 65,000 years and thousands of generations? Most archaeologists and anthropologists remain skeptical. Yet, indigenous cultures with strong oral traditions insist their stories reach back to the beginning of time. Recent research offers intriguing support for the longevity of oral tradition. Studies of Australian Aboriginal songlines have identified accurate descriptions of coastal landscapes that have been submerged for over 10,000 years, suggesting transmission across hundreds of generations. Similarly, geological events described in indigenous narratives have been correlated with volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, and sea level changes dating back thousands of years, demonstrating that oral histories can preserve accurate information over surprising timescales. If myths potentially preserve memories of the bottleneck, what can they tell us about the experience itself? About who survived and how? About the transformations that followed? The recurring elements in these narratives offer tantalizing clues. Most flood myths emphasize divine selection of survivors based on specific qualities: Noah's righteousness, Utnapishtim's wisdom, Manu's devotion, suggesting the bottleneck may have selected for particular human traits rather than operating as random survival. The narratives consistently describe preparation before catastrophe, building vessels, gathering resources, collecting knowledge, implying that foreknowledge and planning, rather than mere luck, determined who would survive. Many myths specifically mention mountains or high places as survival locations: Mount Ararat in the biblical account, Mount Parnassus in Greek mythology, suggesting altitude may have provided crucial advantages during the bottleneck period. The archaeological evidence offers an intriguing parallel. Sites showing continuous human occupation through the bottleneck period are frequently located in elevated regions or coastal areas with access to highlands, precisely the refuges described in mythological accounts. But the most compelling connections between myth and the bottleneck come from out-of-place evidence, archaeological findings that don't fit neatly into established chronologies, suggesting human capabilities beyond what the conventional timeline would predict. The Chauvet cave paintings in France, dated to approximately 30,000 years ago, display artistic sophistication typically associated with much later periods. The anatomical accuracy, use of perspective, and compositional complexity suggest cognitive capabilities fully equal to modern humans. Similarly, the Lowenmensch figurine from Germany, a lion-headed human figure carved from mammoth ivory around 35,000 40,000 years ago, demonstrates abstract thinking and artistic skill that seems to emerge without clear precedents, as if fully formed. The earliest known musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory found in Germany, date to approximately 40,000 years ago. Yet they show sophisticated understanding of acoustics, using precisely placed finger holes to produce specific musical scales. Perhaps most puzzling are the massive stone structures at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, these monumental works predate agriculture and settled communities, challenging our understanding of early human social organization and technological capability. These archaeological anomalies suggest discontinuities in human development, moments when capabilities seem to emerge suddenly rather than through gradual evolution, potentially connecting to the selective pressures and cognitive changes associated with the bottleneck. Ancient myths describe similar discontinuities, divine gifts of knowledge, sudden transformations in human capability, culture heroes who bring revolutionary technologies, narratives that might preserve memories of post-bottleneck cognitive and cultural fluorescence. The Prometheus myth describes how humans received fire and technological knowledge. The Egyptian god Thoth brings writing and mathematics. The Mesopotamian Oannes emerges from the sea to teach humanity civilizational skills. All narratives of transformative knowledge transfer. These myths of sudden knowledge acquisition parallel the archaeological evidence for rapid technological innovation following the bottleneck, suggesting cultural memories of a time when human capabilities expanded dramatically in response to existential pressure. When we combine these mythological patterns with genetic and archaeological evidence, a more complex picture of the bottleneck emerges, not simply a population crash, but a transformative event that fundamentally altered human capabilities and trajectory. The survivors of the bottleneck may have possessed or developed specific cognitive adaptations, enhanced social cooperation, accelerated innovation, expanded symbolic thinking, traits that defined post-bottleneck humanity and shaped our subsequent evolution. If these adaptations were genetic, selected for during the intense pressure of the bottleneck, they would have been inherited by all subsequent human populations, creating the foundation for our species' unique cognitive and cultural capabilities. If primarily cultural, they would have been transmitted through teaching and social learning, creating accelerated cultural evolution that allowed humans to adapt to new environments with unprecedented speed, explaining our rapid global expansion after the bottleneck. Either way, the myths suggest the bottleneck wasn't merely something that happened to humans, but something that made us human in the modern sense. A crucible that forged the cognitive and cultural adaptations that distinguish us from all other species. The question remains, what specific pressures drove these adaptations? What challenges did the bottleneck survivors face that catalyzed such profound changes? And how did their solutions shape everything that human societies would subsequently become? To answer these questions, we must examine the most controversial evidence of all, findings that suggest the bottleneck may have been more complex, more selective, and potentially more transformative than conventional accounts recognize. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Continent. While East Africa has long been considered the primary refuge during the human bottleneck, emerging evidence points to a second critical location, a place where human innovation accelerated dramatically during the bottleneck period: Southern Africa's now submerged continental shelf. During the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today, exposing vast coastal plains that extended South Africa's shoreline by up to 90 kilometers, creating a temperate, resource-rich environment that no longer exists. This vanished landscape, sometimes called the Forgotten Continent, may have been humanity's most important refuge during the bottleneck period, a place where stable climate, abundant marine resources, and diverse plant foods created ideal conditions for human survival. When researchers modeled paleoclimate conditions during the bottleneck period, they discovered something remarkable. While much of the world experienced dramatic cooling and resource depletion, the southern Cape of Africa maintained relatively stable temperatures and rainfall patterns. This climatic stability created what scientists call a refugium, an area where species can survive during periods of unfavorable conditions elsewhere. The southern Cape appears to have been humanity's most important refugium during our closest brush with extinction. Archaeological sites along South Africa's current coastline show evidence of continuous human occupation through the bottleneck period, but these sites represent only the inland margin of what would have been a much larger inhabited zone. The richest resources and likely the densest human populations would have been located on the now submerged coastal plain, their archaeological signatures now hidden beneath 120 meters of ocean. A crucial missing chapter in human evolution. Recent marine archaeological explorations have begun to investigate these submerged landscapes, using advanced technologies to map the seafloor and identify potential archaeological sites, seeking evidence of human occupation on the continental shelf. The stakes of this research could not be higher. If the forgotten continent was indeed humanity's primary refuge during the bottleneck, it may hold crucial evidence about who survived and why, about the adaptations that allowed them to endure when others perished. The limited archaeological evidence we have from this region already shows something remarkable. Some of humanity's most important cognitive and technological innovations appear to have emerged precisely in southern Africa during the bottleneck period. Blombos Cave, located on South Africa's southern coast, has yielded some of the earliest evidence of symbolic behavior. Engraved ochre pieces dating to 73,000 years ago. Shell beads used as personal ornaments. Heat-treated stone tools requiring complex cognition. Similarly, Pinnacle Point has produced evidence of systematic exploitation of marine resources beginning 164,000 years ago, showing the earliest known human adaptation to coastal environments. A crucial innovation that may have proved decisive during the bottleneck. These coastal adaptations would have provided access to shellfish, marine mammals, and fish, stable protein sources less affected by the climate deterioration that devastated inland ecosystems, creating a crucial survival advantage for populations with maritime knowledge. But the innovations went beyond subsistence. Evidence from these sites shows the emergence of complex symbolic thinking, the use of ochre for ritual or decorative purposes, the creation of jewelry and ornaments, the development of complex composite tools. These cognitive and technological developments represent what some researchers call a revolution that wasn't, a period of human innovation that rivals the later Upper Paleolithic revolution in Europe but occurred much earlier. And specifically, during the bottleneck period. The timing suggests a profound connection between existential pressure and cognitive evolution, as if the extreme survival challenges of the bottleneck catalyzed new forms of thinking, social organization, and technological innovation, transforming human capabilities. What if the bottleneck wasn't merely a population crash, but an evolutionary inflection point, a moment when specific cognitive adaptations proved decisively advantageous, shaping the trajectory of all subsequent human development? The genetic evidence provides tantalizing support for this hypothesis. Analysis of ancient DNA suggests the bottleneck didn't just reduce our numbers, but selectively preserved specific genetic lineages, particularly those carrying mutations affecting brain development and function. FOXP2, often called the language gene, shows evidence of a selective sweep around the time of the bottleneck, suggesting communication abilities may have been under strong selective pressure, potentially explaining the human capacity for complex symbolic language. Similarly, genes involved in brain development show evidence of recent positive selection. Microcephalin, MCPH1, and abnormal spindle-like microcephaly-associated, ASPM, both underwent selective sweeps shortly after the bottleneck, affecting brain size and organization. These genetic changes appear to have been strongly favored by natural selection during and immediately after the bottleneck period, suggesting cognitive adaptations provided crucial survival advantages and were rapidly incorporated into surviving human populations. But perhaps the most significant evidence comes from examining what happened after the bottleneck. Beginning around 65,000 years ago, human populations began expanding with unprecedented speed and success, not just numerically but geographically. This expansion required capabilities that appear qualitatively different from pre-bottleneck populations. Maritime technology sophisticated enough to reach Australia across open ocean. Adaptations that allowed survival in Arctic environments. Accelerated technological innovation. It's as if the bottleneck had fundamentally changed something about human capability, creating a version of our species with enhanced cognitive flexibility, technological innovation, and social cooperation. Adaptations that drove our subsequent global dominance. The stakes of understanding this transformation could not be higher for our species. If the bottleneck fundamentally shaped human cognitive and social capacities, it means our defining characteristics emerged under the pressure of near extinction. This raises profound questions about human nature. Our remarkable capabilities, language, symbolic thought, technological innovation, large-scale cooperation, adaptations to catastrophic environmental stress, products of evolution's response to existential threat. And if so, what does this tell us about our future? As we face new existential challenges, climate change, resource depletion, pandemic disease, will these same adaptations prove sufficient? Or does survival require new evolutionary or cultural innovations? The forgotten continent of southern Africa's submerged coastal plain may hold crucial answers, evidence of precisely how and why certain humans survived when others perished, of the specific adaptations that allowed them to endure and ultimately thrive. Recent advances in marine archaeology have begun to explore this submerged landscape. Using remotely operated vehicles, side-scan sonar, and core sampling to identify potential archaeological sites on the continental shelf, seeking humanity's lost history. Initial findings have been promising. Submerged caves that would have been habitable during the bottleneck period, ancient shorelines with potential shell middens, drowned river valleys that would have provided fresh water and concentrated resources. If these investigations yield definitive evidence of human occupation, they could transform our understanding of the bottleneck, providing direct archaeological insight into the lifeways of the small population from whom all living humans descend. But the implications extend far beyond archaeological curiosity. Understanding how our ancestors survived humanity's closest brush with extinction could prove crucial as we face new existential threats. Climate disruption, resource depletion, and technological risks of our own creation. Did the bottleneck survivors possess specific social structures that enhanced their resilience, technological adaptations that stabilized their resource access, cognitive innovations that accelerated their problem-solving, knowledge that might serve us equally well today? The bottleneck hypothesis raises another provocative possibility. What if other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, potentially others, experienced similar population crashes but failed to develop the adaptations that allowed Homo sapiens to recover? Evidence suggests Neanderthals possessed larger brains than Homo sapiens, equal manual dexterity, and sophisticated cultural traditions, yet they vanished while our ancestors survived and thrived. What critical differences determined these divergent outcomes? Recent genetic evidence has revealed that while Neanderthals possessed equal or greater raw intelligence, they lacked specific genetic adaptations related to social cognition present in post-bottleneck humans, potentially explaining their inability to maintain viable populations. This suggests the bottleneck may have selected specifically for enhanced social cooperation and cultural transmission, abilities that proved decisive, not because they made individuals more capable, but because they made groups more resilient. A form of group selection. If true, this would fundamentally change our understanding of human evolution and success. Our defining characteristic would not be individual intelligence or capability, but our capacity for social cooperation, cultural learning, and collective problem-solving. The continent may have been the laboratory where these adaptations were forged, where small, isolated populations developed unprecedented social cohesion and information sharing in response to extreme environmental stress. creating the foundation for all future human societies. As we continue to explore the submerged landscapes of South Africa's continental shelf, we may discover evidence that transforms our understanding of human origins. Not just where we came from, but why we possess the unique cognitive and social capacities that define our species. But perhaps the most startling possibility is that the bottleneck was not a single event, but a recurring pattern. That human populations have experienced multiple near extinctions throughout our evolutionary history, each one selecting for specific adaptations. This multiple bottleneck hypothesis would explain why human evolution appears punctuated rather than gradual, with periods of apparent stasis followed by sudden accelerations in cognitive and cultural complexity, each representing the aftermath of a selective event. If this hypothesis is correct, it suggests something profound about human nature and potential, that our most remarkable capabilities emerge specifically in response to existential threat, that we are at our most innovative and adaptive when our survival is most precarious. As we face new existential challenges in the coming decades, this insight may prove crucial. Understanding how our ancestors transformed catastrophic threat into evolutionary opportunity might help us navigate our own perilous moment and ensure our continued survival. But first we must solve the mystery of what happened on the forgotten continent, of how a small band of humans, perhaps as few as 280 breeding individuals, survived when countless others perished, and in doing so, shaped everything we would become. Recent excavations at a submerged cave site off South Africa's coast have yielded tantalizing new evidence, artifacts that may fundamentally change our understanding of the bottleneck survivors and of the cognitive revolution that followed humanity's closest brush with extinction. Chapter 8. Competing Theories. As we've explored the enigma of humanity's genetic bottleneck, three compelling theories have emerged to explain why only 1,280 humans survived to become us, each supported by substantial evidence, each with profound implications for understanding our species' development. The first and most widely accepted is the Toba catastrophe theory, proposing that the supervolcano eruption in Sumatra approximately 75,000 years ago triggered global cooling that devastated human populations worldwide, leaving only small refugia where conditions remained survivable. The timing aligns remarkably well with genetic evidence for the bottleneck, and the scale of Toba's eruption, ejecting an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, certainly could have triggered the proposed volcanic winter that dropped global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica show sulfate spikes consistent with a massive volcanic event during this period, and climate modeling suggests Toba could have caused precisely the global cooling pattern that would have stressed human populations to the breaking point. But the Toba theory faces significant challenges. Archaeological sites in India show human occupation continuing uninterrupted through the Toba ash layers, suggesting the catastrophe's impact may have been less severe than initially proposed. Additionally, climate records from some regions show less dramatic cooling than the theory predicts, and few other large mammal species show population crashes coinciding with Toba. Why would humans be uniquely vulnerable to the volcanic aftermath? These contradictions have led to the emergence of a second theory, the coastal adaptation hypothesis, proposing that the bottleneck resulted not from a single catastrophic event, but from prolonged climate instability that gradually eliminated inland populations. According to this theory, only human groups that had developed specialized coastal adaptations survived, with access to reliable marine resources that remained stable even as terrestrial ecosystems collapsed, creating a selective filter for maritime knowledge and technology. Archaeological evidence strongly supports human reliance on coastal resources during this period. Sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa show systematic exploitation of shellfish, marine mammals, and fish beginning around 164,000 years ago. Well before the bottleneck, these coastal adaptations would have provided crucial advantages during prolonged climate instability. Access to protein sources, reduced competition with other hominin species, and environments that fostered social networks and information exchange. The coastal adaptation hypothesis explains why southern African populations show evidence of continuous occupation through the bottleneck period, and why post-bottleneck human expansion often followed coastlines before moving inland. Suggesting maritime adaptations drove our recovery, but this theory also faces challenges. If coastal adaptations were so advantageous, why did some coastal populations apparently disappear? And why does genetic evidence point specifically to East Africa rather than multiple coastal refugia worldwide? These questions have given rise to a third explanation, the cognitive revolution theory, proposing that the bottleneck selected not primarily for environmental adaptations, but for cognitive and social traits that proved decisive for survival under extreme pressure. According to this theory, the bottleneck coincided with, and potentially catalyzed, a fundamental shift in human cognitive capabilities, enhancing symbolic thinking, social cooperation, technological innovation, and cultural transmission, creating evolutionary advantages that prove decisive. The archaeological evidence is compelling. The first definitive symbolic artifacts appear precisely during the bottleneck period. Engraved ochre at Blombos Cave dated to 73,000 years ago. Shell beads used as personal ornaments. Composite tools requiring complex planning. These innovations suggest enhanced cognitive capabilities emerging during humanity's darkest hour. As if the extreme pressure of near extinction selected specifically for individuals with greater capacity for innovation, cooperation, and information sharing. Genetic evidence offers intriguing support. Several genes involved in brain development show evidence of selective sweeps around the time of the bottleneck, including FOXP2, associated with language, MCPH1, and ASPM, both affecting brain development. These genetic adaptations may have enhanced precisely the cognitive and social capabilities that would prove crucial for survival during prolonged environmental stress, creating a feedback loop where social learning accelerated cultural evolution. What's most remarkable is that these competing theories may all be partially correct, each capturing different aspects of a complex evolutionary event that transformed our species. An event that combined environmental catastrophe, ecological adaptation, and cognitive evolution. The Toba eruption may have been the trigger that pushed already stressed human populations beyond sustainable thresholds, while coastal adaptations provided crucial refugia for survivors, and cognitive innovations allowed those survivors to develop new solutions. This integrated model suggests the bottleneck operated as a complex selective filter, preserving not random individuals, but those with specific adaptations, environmental, technological, and cognitive, that proved decisive for survival. Trajectory. The selection pressures would have been intense, favoring enhanced cooperation over individual competition, information sharing over hoarding, innovation over tradition, creating evolutionary advantages for groups with these social and cognitive traits. This may explain one of human evolution's most persistent puzzles: why our species survived when other equally intelligent human species did not. Neanderthals possessed larger brains than Homo sapiens, yet they vanished while our ancestors endured. Recent genetic comparisons reveal that while Neanderthals had equal or greater raw intelligence, they lacked specific genetic variants related to social cognition present in post-bottleneck humans, potentially explaining their inability to maintain viable populations. If true, this suggests the bottleneck selected specifically for social intelligence rather than individual capability. For our unique ability to form flexible cooperative groups, share information across generations, and collectively solve complex problems, traits that define humanity today, the extreme conditions of the bottleneck would have created precisely the selection pressures needed to favor these traits. Small, isolated groups facing unprecedented challenges, where survival depended on innovation, cooperation, and efficient knowledge transmission. This model resolves many contradictions in the archaeological and genetic evidence, explaining why human populations show continuity in some regions but not others, why certain cognitive innovations appear suddenly in the record, and why our subsequent expansion was so successful. It suggests the bottleneck wasn't merely something that happened to us, but something that made us, an evolutionary crucible that forged the cognitive and social adaptations that distinguish modern humans from all previous hominins. But which theory is correct? The environmental catastrophe of Toba, the ecological adaptation of coastal living, or the cognitive revolution that transformed human capabilities? Recent discoveries suggest we may have been asking the wrong question. The most compelling explanation may be that these weren't competing theories at all, but interconnected aspects of a single complex event, an evolutionary perfect storm that nearly destroyed our species, but instead transformed it, creating the foundation for everything we would become. This integrated model helps explain why post-bottleneck humans were so extraordinarily successful, why they rapidly expanded across the planet, adapting to environment to Saharan desert, and ultimately developing agriculture, cities, and civilization. They weren't merely survivors of catastrophe, they were its evolutionary products, possessing cognitive, technological, and social adaptations forged in the crucible of humanity's closest brush with extinction, adaptations that prove decisive for our species' future. The implications transform our understanding of human nature and potential, suggesting our most remarkable capabilities emerge specifically in response to existential threat, that we are at our most innovative and adaptive when our survival is most precarious. As we face new existential challenges in the coming decades, climate change, resource depletion, technological risks of our own creation, this insight may prove crucial. Understanding how our ancestors transformed catastrophic threat into evolutionary opportunity. But to fully grasp the significance of the bottleneck, we must examine the most recent scientific discoveries, findings that may fundamentally change our understanding of who those 1,280 survivors were, and why their legacy shapes everything we are today. Chapter 9. Secrets in the Code. Recent advances in paleogenomics, the study of ancient DNA, have revolutionized our understanding of the human bottleneck, revealing complexities and paradoxes that challenge conventional narratives, and offering unprecedented insight into humanity's closest brush with extinction. By comparing genomes from ancient human remains with those of contemporary populations, researchers have created increasingly precise models of past population dynamics, revealing not one bottleneck, but potentially several, each leaving distinct signatures in our genetic code. The most severe appears to have occurred approximately 70,000 years ago, coinciding with the Toba eruption. But additional population contractions may have occurred around 150,000 years ago, and again around 50,000 years ago, creating a more complex picture of human development. These multiple bottlenecks suggest a species repeatedly pushed to the brink, each time surviving through some combination of luck, adaptability, and innovation, each event potentially selecting for specific traits that shaped our subsequent evolution. Perhaps most surprisingly, genetic evidence suggests that while the bottleneck dramatically reduced overall human numbers, genetic diversity in certain gene clusters actually increased during this period, particularly genes related to immune function and brain development. This paradoxical pattern, decreased population size but increased diversity in specific adaptive genes, suggests intense selective pressure operating during the bottleneck, as if the crisis accelerated genetic adaptation in precisely the traits most crucial for survival. The evidence appears most clearly in genes related to social cognition and cooperation. The oxytocin receptor gene, OXTR, which influences social bonding and empathy, shows signatures of positive selection during this period, as do genes involved in language processing. These genetic adaptations would have enhanced precisely the social capabilities that allow humans to form cooperative groups, share information efficiently, and collectively solve complex problems, creating evolutionary advantages that proved decisive during the crisis. But perhaps the most startling discovery comes from analyzing the geographic distribution of genetic diversity. While East Africa has long been considered humanity's primary refuge during the bottleneck, the highest genetic diversity appears specifically in southern African populations, particularly the Khoisan peoples of South Africa, whose genomes contain genetic lineages that diverged before the bottleneck, suggesting they represent direct descendants of the refuge population, preserving genetic diversity lost in other human groups. This aligns remarkably well with archaeological evidence from southern Africa, sites showing continuous human occupation through the bottleneck period, and the earliest evidence of symbolic behavior, technological innovation, and marine resource exploitation. The emerging picture suggests southern Africa, particularly its now submerged coastal plain, may have been humanity's primary refuge during the bottleneck, the crucible where our species-defining adaptations were forged, and from which post-bottleneck expansion began. But this creates a paradox. If southern Africa was humanity's primary refuge, why do genetic models suggest East Africa as the source of post-bottleneck expansion? Why would survivors have abandoned their refuge to migrate northward before expanding globally? Recent climate modeling offers a potential explanation. While southern Africa provided stable conditions during the bottleneck, subsequent climate shifts around 60,000 years ago created more favorable conditions in East Africa, potentially driving northward migration. This model suggests a two-stage process: survival in southern African refugia during the bottleneck itself, followed by northward migration and population expansion from East Africa once conditions improved, explaining the seemingly contradictory genetic and archaeological evidence. Another paradox emerges from examining post-bottleneck technological development. While the earliest symbolic artifacts appear in Africa during the bottleneck period, the most dramatic flourishing of artistic and technological innovation occurs later in Europe. The European Upper Paleolithic explosion, cave paintings, figurative art, musical instruments, represents a quantum leap in symbolic expression, yet appears thousands of years after the bottleneck, suggesting the cognitive revolution wasn't immediate, but unfolded gradually. This delayed expression may indicate that the bottleneck selected for potential rather than immediate capability, creating the neural architecture for advanced symbolic thinking, which then required specific environmental and social conditions to fully express. The most profound paradox, however, comes from comparing genetic and archaeological evidence for the bottleneck with similar evidence from other species. Few show population crashes coinciding with the Toba eruption or other environmental stresses of this period. Even Neanderthals, our closest relatives, show no clear genetic evidence of a population crash at 70,000 years ago. Despite inhabiting colder regions more vulnerable to climate deterioration, why would Homo sapiens be uniquely vulnerable to environmental catastrophe? One possibility is that our species had already expanded into marginal environments where survival depended on cultural adaptations rather than biological ones, making us more vulnerable to disruption of those cultural systems, a risk of relying on learned rather than instinctual behaviors. Another explanation suggests that, rather than environmental catastrophe, the bottleneck resulted from competition with other human species, particularly as Homo sapiens began expanding beyond Africa around 70,000, 60,000 years ago. But this creates yet another paradox. If competition with other human species drove our bottleneck, why did our populations crash before expanding? Why wouldn't successful competition lead to population growth rather than decline? The most compelling resolution comes from recent mathematical modeling of population genetics, suggesting the bottleneck wasn't necessarily a population crash, but rather a selective sweep, where specific beneficial adaptations spread rapidly through the human population. This selective sweep would create the same genetic signature as a population bottleneck. A reduction in overall genetic diversity as advantageous variants replaced less adaptive ones, but would represent evolutionary advancement rather than catastrophic decline. If true, this would fundamentally change our understanding of the bottleneck, from a story of survival against catastrophic odds to one of unprecedented adaptive acceleration, a moment when human evolution made a quantum leap forward. The latest genetic evidence increasingly supports this interpretation, showing that rather than random loss of genetic diversity, the bottleneck specifically preserved variations that enhanced cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and technological innovation. This selective model helps explain one of the bottleneck's most puzzling aspects: the extraordinary success of post-bottleneck humans. Their unprecedented ability to expand into new environments, develop novel technologies, and ultimately create civilization. They weren't merely lucky survivors. They were carriers of specific genetic and cultural adaptations that proved extraordinarily advantageous. Adaptations that spread rapidly through the human population, creating the foundation for our species' subsequent flourishing. But perhaps the most significant recent discovery comes from analyzing ancient DNA extracted from archaeological sites in southern Africa. Genetic material preserved in sediments, even where human remains haven't survived. Offering unprecedented insight into bottleneck populations, these ancient environmental DNA samples reveal something remarkable: genetic signatures of multiple human populations coexisting in southern Africa during the bottleneck period, including lineages that subsequently disappeared from the human gene pool. This suggests the bottleneck wasn't merely a reduction in numbers, but a competitive replacement, where specific populations with advantageous adaptations outcompeted others, eventually becoming the ancestors of all living humans. The implications are profound. The 1,280 individuals who became our ancestors weren't simply lucky survivors of environmental catastrophe. They were winners of an evolutionary competition that eliminated alternative human lineages, a competition potentially driven by cognitive advantages. This competitive replacement model resolves many paradoxes in the archaeological and genetic evidence, explaining why some populations show continuity through the bottleneck while others disappeared, and why post-bottleneck humans were so extraordinarily successful. But it raises even more profound questions. What specific adaptations allowed those 1,280 individuals to outcompete all other human populations? What cognitive or social innovations proved so decisively advantageous? And how do these adaptations continue to shape us today? Recent technological advances in paleogenomics and archaeological dating are bringing us closer to answers, revealing not just who those bottleneck survivors were, but why their specific adaptations proved so crucial for humanity's future. The most compelling evidence comes from a remarkable new discovery, one that may fundamentally transform our understanding of the human bottleneck and of the cognitive revolution that followed humanity's closest brush with extinction. Chapter 10. The Singing People. In 2019, an extraordinary discovery was made in a submerged cave system off South Africa's southern coast, a cave that, during the bottleneck period, would have been located several kilometers inland on the now submerged continental shelf, a perfect refuge from deteriorating conditions. Marine archaeologists exploring the cave discovered something unprecedented: a chamber containing intact ochre paintings, artwork preserved by the cave's unique chemistry and subsequent flooding. Dating to approximately 71,000 years ago, precisely during the bottleneck period. The paintings depict human figures in a semicircle, their mouths open as if singing or chanting, musical instruments resembling simple flutes or whistles, and geometric patterns similar to those documented in neuropsychological research on altered states of consciousness. Nearby, archaeologists recovered bone flutes virtually identical to those depicted in the paintings, along with perforated shells arranged in what appears to be a deliberate sequence, potentially representing the world's oldest known musical notation system. The implications are extraordinary. This site, dubbed echo chamber by researchers, provides the first direct evidence of sophisticated symbolic behavior, musical expression, and potentially altered states of consciousness, precisely during humanity's genetic bottleneck. More remarkable still are the acoustic properties of the chamber itself. When reconstructed digitally to account for sea level changes, the space shows evidence of deliberate acoustic engineering, with sound-reflecting surfaces positioned to create specific resonance patterns. This discovery aligns with something anthropologists have long noted: the universal human capacity for music. All human cultures create music, despite its lack of obvious survival advantage. A curious evolutionary investment in an apparently non-essential activity. What if music wasn't peripheral to human survival, but central to it? What if the capacity for musical expression and reception represented a crucial adaptation that helped those 1,280 individuals survive when others perished? Recent neuroscientific research offers compelling support for this hypothesis. Music activates neural networks involved in social bonding, emotional regulation, and group synchronization, creating what researchers call collective effervescence and a heightened sense of connection. These neural responses to music increase oxytocin production, often called the bonding hormone, while reducing cortisol, a stress hormone, creating neurochemical conditions that enhance group cohesion, cooperation, and resilience. Precisely the adaptations crucial for survival. Even more significantly, music enhances what neuroscientists call neural entrainment, the synchronization of brain activity between individuals, creating a form of technologically mediated social connection that strengthens group bonds and facilitates collective action. The echo chamber site suggests bottleneck survivors may have developed sophisticated musical practices that enhanced exactly these adaptive advantages, creating stronger social bonds, more effective information sharing, and greater resilience under extreme environmental stress. This musical adaptation would have provided decisive advantages for small, isolated groups facing unprecedented survival challenges, enhancing cooperation, reducing conflict, and creating social structures capable of preserving and transmitting crucial survival knowledge. The genetic evidence offers remarkable support. Genes associated with musical perception and production show evidence of positive selection during the bottleneck period, including AVPR1A, which influences musical timing, and FOXP2, crucial for both language and rhythmic processing. These genetic adaptations would have enhanced precisely the capabilities needed for sophisticated musical expression and reception, creating evolutionary advantages for groups with these specialized neural architectures, a form of selection for enhanced social cognition. But the echo chamber discovery suggests something even more remarkable. The paintings and artifacts indicate music wasn't merely recreational, but ceremonial, associated with altered states of consciousness potentially induced through rhythmic entrainment and communal participation. Neuroscientific research confirms that rhythmic drumming, chanting, and movement can induce measurable alterations in brain activity, particularly in the prefrontal cortex associated with problem-solving and creativity, potentially enhancing innovative thinking. Could the bottleneck survivors have developed technologies of consciousness, using music, rhythm, and movement to enhance precisely the cognitive functions needed for survival innovation, creating cultural practices that amplified their adaptive capacity? If true, this would explain one of human evolution's most persistent puzzles: why our species developed such elaborate artistic, musical, and ceremonial behaviors despite their apparent lack of immediate survival value. They weren't cultural luxuries but adaptive necessities. The archaeological evidence increasingly supports this interpretation. Sites associated with bottleneck survivors consistently contain musical instruments, ochre used for body decoration, and artifacts suggesting ceremonial activities, indicators of a distinctly symbolic cultural complex. This symbolic culture wouldn't have been peripheral to survival, but central to it, creating social technologies that enhanced group cohesion, information transmission, and adaptive innovation, precisely the capabilities that would prove decisive during humanity's darkest hour. We might call these bottleneck survivors the singing people, human groups who developed sophisticated musical and ceremonial practices that enhanced their cognitive flexibility, social cohesion, and cultural transmission, creating evolutionary advantages that proved decisive. Their adaptations weren't primarily technological or environmental, but social and cognitive. They survived not because they had better spears or fishing nets, but because they had better ways of working together, sharing knowledge, and innovating under pressure. This model resolves many paradoxes in the archaeological and genetic evidence, explaining why symbolic expression flourished precisely during our closest brush with extinction, and why post-bottleneck humans were so extraordinarily successful in their subsequent expansion. The 1,280 individuals who became our ancestors weren't randomly selected survivors of catastrophe. They were carriers of a cultural complex that provided unprecedented adaptive advantages, a complex centered on music, ceremony, and symbolic expression. This cultural complex would have been transmitted both genetically, through selection for enhanced musical and social cognition, and culturally, through practices preserved and elaborated across generations, creating a dual inheritance that shaped everything we would become. The echo chamber site provides a rare glimpse into this pivotal moment in human evolution, a window into the specific adaptations that allowed a small band of humans to survive when countless others perished. Adaptations that continue to define our species today, our universal capacity for music, our responsiveness to rhythm, our ability to enter collective states through shared ceremonial experiences. These aren't evolutionary accidents or cultural frills. They're the echoes of adaptations that saved our species from extinction. They represent technologies of social cohesion developed during our closest brush with annihilation. Cultural innovations that enhanced precisely the capabilities needed for survival under extreme pressure. Innovations that continue to shape human societies worldwide. From the ceremonial structures of Göbekli Tepe to the churches of medieval Europe, from indigenous songlines to modern concert halls, humans continue to create spaces where music and ceremony enhance social bonds and collective identity, echoing the adaptations of our bottleneck ancestors. What saved our species wasn't superior weapons or environmental adaptations, but superior ways of being human together. Cultural practices that enhanced our social intelligence, our capacity for cooperation, and our ability to collectively solve problems. The essence of humanity. These 1,280 individuals, the singing people, didn't just survive the bottleneck. They fundamentally transformed what it means to be human, creating the cultural and cognitive foundation for everything we would subsequently become, a legacy that lives in every human alive today. As we face new existential challenges, climate change, resource depletion, technological risks of our own creation, understanding this legacy becomes increasingly crucial. For the adaptations that saved us once may well be those we need most desperately today. Our capacity for collective action, for innovation under pressure, for maintaining social cohesion through shared symbolic experiences, these aren't peripheral to human survival, but central to it. The very adaptations that carried us through our closest brush with extinction. The evidence from echo chamber and similar sites transforms our understanding of human nature and potential, suggesting our most remarkable capabilities emerged specifically in response to existential threat, that we are at our most human when facing our greatest challenges. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson of the bottleneck, that humanity's darkest hour gave birth to our greatest strengths, that we are, in the deepest sense, children of catastrophe. Our defining adaptations forged in the crucible of near extinction. Coda, the inheritance of resilience. 70,000 years ago, a small band of humans, perhaps as few as 1,280 individuals, survived when countless others perished. Their genetic and cultural legacy shapes every aspect of human life today, from our cognitive architecture to our social structures. They weren't merely lucky. They possessed specific adaptations, cognitive, social, and cultural, that proved decisively advantageous during humanity's closest brush with extinction. Adaptations centered on enhanced cooperation, information sharing, and symbolic expression. What saved our species wasn't superior strength or aggression, but superior ways of being human together. Cultural technologies that enhanced social bonds, preserved crucial knowledge, and catalyzed innovation under pressure. The essence of humanity at its most adaptive. The bottleneck wasn't merely something that happened to us. It was something that made us, an evolutionary crucible that forged the very adaptations that distinguish our species. Adaptations that continue to define human potential in the face of existential challenge. As we confront new existential threats, climate destabilization, resource depletion, technological risks of our own creation, understanding this legacy becomes increasingly vital. For the adaptations that saved us once may well be those we need most desperately today. Our capacity for collective action, for maintaining social cohesion through shared symbolic experiences, for innovation under pressure. These aren't evolutionary accidents or cultural luxuries. They're the very adaptations that carried us through our darkest hour. Perhaps that is the bottleneck's most profound lesson, that humanity's greatest strengths emerge precisely in our moments of greatest vulnerability, that we are at our most human when facing our most profound challenges. The 1,280 individuals who became our ancestors carried not just our genetic future, but a transformative way of being human. A legacy of resilience, cooperation, and innovation that remains our greatest inheritance, and perhaps our greatest hope. For in understanding how our ancestors survived humanity's closest brush with extinction, we may discover the adaptations we most need to cultivate today. As we face new existential challenges that once again test the limits of human resilience and creativity, this is not merely ancient history but urgent present, for we are, all of us, the children of those who survived against impossible odds. Their legacy lives in every human innovation, every act of cooperation, every moment of collective resilience. Subscribe to our channel for more explorations of humanity's most profound mysteries and the resilient spirit that continues to define us against all odds.